Hello friends, welcome to Research Life. I am your host, Dr. Sabyasachi Sengupta, founder and director of Sengupta's Research Academy and practicing vitreoretinal surgeon in Mumbai. Research Live is a platform meant to ignite the spirit of clinical research amongst all of us. Here I host some of the most eminent researchers in India and am confident that their journey will inspire us all.
Hello friends, I hope you have been enjoying the episodes of Research Live so far. Today in episode 4, we have the charismatic Dr. Rohit Shetty with us. He is currently the Vice Chairman of Narayan Nethralaya, a clinician and translational scientist at the GROW Labs at Narayan Nethralaya, and an Associate Professor in Ophthalmology at the Maastricht University in Netherlands. Dr. Shetty specializes in cornea and refractive surgery and is a clinician scientist with a keen interest in keratoconus and corneal ectatic disorders. He has been practicing high-volume refractive surgery for the past 14 years. He did his MBBS from the Kempegowda Institute of Medical Sciences in Bangalore and his residency as a Diplomate in National Board in Ophthalmology at the St. John's Medical College. Dr. Shetty then obtained his fellowship from the Royal College of Surgeons of Glasgow in 2006 and is currently an FRCS examiner. He is the chief mentor for the dual academic program, that is the PhD and Clinical Fellowship at Narayan Nethralaya Eye Institute in Bangalore and the Maastricht University. Dr. Shetty has over 200 publications in peer-reviewed journals and several national and international presentations and book chapters to his credit. He is on the editorial board of the prestigious Journal of Refractive Surgery and is a regular reviewer for the British and American Journals of Ophthalmology, IOVS, Asia Pacific Journal of Ophthalmology, Journal of Refractive Surgery, and the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. Dr. Shetty has forayed into interdisciplinary research by setting up several labs to better understand the importance of basic sciences. He has set up Novel, a dedicated optics lab which can help to improve the quality of vision. He has also been instrumental in setting up the Multinomics diagnostic labs for genomic testing in association with MedGenome. Additionally, he has also set up ANGEL, which stands for the Advanced Novel Genetic Evaluating Lab, and GROW, which stands for Genes, Repair and Regeneration in Ophthalmic Workstation. Dr. Shetty is also an investigator for various research projects such as establishing a proteomics laboratory for the discovery of ocular biomarkers and analyzing drug responses in corneal surface disorders. Owing to a keen interest in dry eye disorders, he has set up CODE, a specialty clinic that deals with the disorders of the tear film. Dr. Shetty is one of the key persons involved in the formation of the Tear Film Society of India. In his capacity as the Vice Chairman of Narayan Nethralaya, Dr. Shetty has left no stone unturned to take it to great heights. He has brought in the latest in innovation and technology and has been instrumental in making the hospital amongst the best in the state and country. In 2015, he was awarded a PhD for his work on keratoconus from the Maastricht University, Netherlands. He has several awards to his credit, including the Caspier Award for Outstanding Contribution to Refractive Surgery presented by the ISRS in 2019, the IGO Gold Award for his paper on decision-making nomograms for intrastromal corneal ring segments in keratoconus, an Achievement Award from the American Academy of Ophthalmology in 2015, the Colonel Rangachari Award for Best Overall Paper at the All India Ophthalmology Conference in 2015, and a lot more. It is indeed a great pleasure to have Dr. Rohit Shetty today with us. And as you will see, he is a deep thinker, a visionary, and a true motivator, in addition to being blessed with style and finesse. So let's hear it from him.
Thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your journey of research and publications, which has really been trailblazing.
Thank you. At the onset, thank you, Dr. Sengupta, and it's been wonderful listening to your talks and your beautiful website for the juniors. I made sure many of my people have passed through it, and I'm sure you're doing a great service trying to spread knowledge on something which is very important, and I really congratulate you on this and wish you all the best.
Right. So the first question is, how did your research and publications journey start, and what motivated you?
To answer your first question about when was the first publication and what really triggered off. So my journey, I'm close to 19 years in this organization now, from the time I finished my post-graduation. So from first 3 or 4 years, I used to attend this conferences, the ASCRS, ESCRS. Mm-hmm. And those were the times I used to see the presentation and the good presentation, the one which impresses you, could always have 50 to 60% of whatever they present is their work. And everything they present on a slide used to have their work cited with their own papers. And I used to wonder, unlike during that time, most of our presentations here, including mine, used to be just textbook, copy paste here and there. Nothing is your original. At that point of time, I realized that this is what I need to be. I should have at least 60 to 70. If I'm speaking for 10 minutes, 6 to 7 minutes should be my work. And whatever I speak should have a published peer-reviewed journal. So that was the whole interest. To be very frank, that is exactly what it started. I'm sure a lot of you would also have the same journey. So I picked up, the first paper was a case report. It took another 4-5 years for me to write a case report then on a confocal microscopy. And we studied a different form of post-LASIK. We had a patient who had a lot of edema on the flap, and there was nothing great on that, but we just had a confocal microscopy then. We studied it, and we published that. That's the first paper in JCRS. And but what is interesting is, with that paper, the journey of asking questions to being very curious. What else can you do apart from whatever you see on a slit lamp? That started. So this is the journey. What I can summarize from the first paper to close to 200, 225 now.
Right.
That's what I had.
Right. And so it really started with something which was, as you describe it, not so special, but then it took on, but it took the form of something special, I think, eventually.
Absolutely.
Right. I think that's a great message that we can send out to people listening.
There's one more story. I think it may be a little later, not my first paper. Mm-hmm. So I'd been to US, and I did go to a person who was a cataract and a retina surgeon then. So he was giving some kind of an injection in his room. That time the injection era had just, I don't think Lucentis had just, Avastin is the only one. So I asked him, what injection is this? And he said, oh, you know what, this is called Avastin. We reconstituted. It's the next big thing and all that. So I still remember texting or emailing my team down here, why don't you, Roche makes it, I think, and why don't you go and check? This was a very early phase. In India, nobody was speaking about it. And then slowly we started, and you can imagine the excitement of people when you see edema, which was 400 micron, reducing next day morning to 200 and all that. But very important thing I want to tell you at that point of time, everybody had done everything, whatever positive off-label use. You won't believe that nobody had done an electrophysiological test on the retina. It's not that they did not have it. In fact, every institute had it. But for some reason, a lot of countries were just adopting it, and electrophysiologists had not got too deep into that. I guess that's what I think. So I was also looking after electrophysiology at that point. That was my first primary area of interest. I love electrophysiology. So I told my retina colleagues, you know what, there is a lacuna here. We should quickly do a paper on this, because nobody has figured out what really happens on your macular function as far as the multifocal ERG was concerned. So we did a big study on that, and we published this in AJO. And AJO, I still remember, I think they quickly reviewed it within 2 days, I think. And for the first time, they asked us to send our entire Excel sheet. Probably they did not believe that, some unknown names, a bunch of people have done some study. In fact, what we said is it was changing functionally. It was not grossly making the dead retina function well. So whatever was non-functional, it was functioning better. I vaguely remember the results. We sent the entire Excel sheet. They made somebody to do a restats, and there were 2 small changes on the stats, and they said, change this. So I'm just giving an example. you had to find a lacunae, what is not done. And that paper is one of my heavily cited paper. I have something like 200 or 280 or 300 citation from all the big, because afterwards, whoever talks about the safety of Avastin, it's very, very rare somebody has not cited that paper. So I remember this very clearly. This is for your audience. Anything which comes, you'll always first have to find where is the lacunae. If you find a lacunae, you will find a lacunae. You pick up that and be the first mover. We got in because we are not the biggest electrophysiologists of the world. We just had a good machine, but we were faster.
Yeah, I think that important message coming out is that start early, or basically find the lacuna and pursue it. The earlier, the better that you get at it, right? All right. So this is fascinating. So many different things, and how you became who you are. The second question was, did you have a mentor or someone that you looked up to, that you wanted to be like?
Being in the last 18, 19 years, having mentored more than 100, 125 people, I always feel there is a special need of a mentor. But when I started, there were a lot of other circumstances which I could not do a fellowship proper. So I don't call it mentor, but this question I keep getting asked by many people. Who is your mentor? The answer may look very philosophical, but trust me, this is exactly the mentor I had. Your last mistake was my mentor. And when you are self-learning, which I think should not be the case today, you have a lot of good places, a lot of good trainers, including your beautiful website, which can mentor a lot of them. I feel you should have a mentor. But I did a lot of mistakes. And every time you look back and say, you shred your ego and just go back and say, okay, this was a mistake. Okay, this is my teacher. So last mistake was my best teacher, and I still consider that my biggest mentor, even today.
So I think another very powerful message that comes out, that we all learn from our mistakes and basically keep getting better and better, like you've shown. How important do you think is it to start your journey early, maybe even in MBBS days or during residency? Do you think it is okay to start late?
There is nothing called start or end. It's just what your calling is. Unfortunately, our system of education is very difficult in MBBS to be inspired on anything. MBBS is all about passing, and MS is all about finding your skill, whether I be able to be a good surgeon or not. Comes to fellowship, you have to pick up a fellowship. I'm sure you have many people talking about it. I keep telling it to my students. I always give an example of, there was an ad which was myjob.naukri.com or something, some ad. If you look at that ad, it's a very classic analogy I bring into all this, all the time I explain. There's some guy who's stuck in the wrong place, and how you don't find the right job, you get in the wrong place. A boy wanted to be a cricket player, but he could not. He becomes a dhobi. So he's wearing his full cricket gear, and with the bat he is hitting the clothes. So it's a very classic thing, which happens to us. If you want to get into good research, you have to join a place which encourages you, that is part of your life. If you want to learn surgery, you have to pick up which gives you a lot of surgery. If you pick up the wrong side, then you end up in a wrong, you have a lot of issues with the wrong decision. So what I feel is, at this point of time, I really feel that you need a mentor. A mentor who picks up what you want to do. If you are not a paper person or a research person, you get in a wrong state because you want to learn surgery, but you are caught in the wrong group. So once you get that trigger, then I always say it's like, it's a nasha. You just gets on to you. Your first paper, it comes, the pleasure of first paper, then you reach 100, 200, 300, whatever. So there is no right time to join. You just need a right trigger. And the trigger happens most of the time, if it's not self-driven, then the trigger can only happen through somebody you meet or speak. And for all the youngsters listening, if you feel that you have the trigger and you want to work with somebody, and you have the means or time to work with somebody, you just meet them, like they want to work with you, just text them. And I mean, the world is now very easy. You don't have to meet face to face, and if you say no, to get embarrassed. So if you want something, go for it.
Very important message again. I think that there is no early or late, and you really have to make up your mind and go for it. Right. All right. The next question was, do you think it is important to have formal training in research methodology before you start, or is it okay to keep learning, as you go on the job?
As you go on the job was 10 years back, 15 years back. There's nothing called learn on the job. It's very difficult. It has to be, you have to learn simultaneously, but you have to take a professional course. Now with people like you, it's so easy. There was nothing earlier. We used to have those books, and the books are very difficult because it's a one-way learning. You can't ask, you can't, especially those stats, and they're very written also very badly, so dull and so melodic. So I feel they should take up a course, get themselves ready, and when you're on the job, what happens is you will learn this better. See, like, for example, many times I ask them to take one of your courses, and then they get on the job, then they do an analysis of every Excel sheet. Now, what we do is, if we are doing a study and we have an Excel, I try to give that Excel to 4 or 5 of my junior fellows and tell them, I'm not bothered about what statistics they're getting, because I know we have done our stats. But I tell them to do it so that they also learn what it is. So, but it will be very nice if they have a formal training. Formal training is a must. Good clinical practice is one important area of interest. The training what you're giving is very important. And then learning about ethics based, reading a paper, what you keep publishing. All these are very important in today's world.
Probably better to get yourself trained.
It's not better, it's a must. It's a must.
It's a must. Right.
So there's nothing called an option here.
All right. So next question is, how important is an international stint, do you think, to improve your clinical research skills? Do you think it is a must? It's good to get a lot of people looking for international stints, but so what is your take on that?
International stint is good, but I would say not to learn but to inspire. So if you go to an international thing, you learn a lot, but more than learning, I think you get inspired. Okay, we can do this. But I think if you talk about, say, 8 or 9 good institutes in the country doing good research today, I have no doubt in my mind that you will not probably get anything better than what you can get in 8 or 9 of these institutes or more. And to be very frank, and on screen, I can say that our research moves much faster than anywhere in the world, in spite of limitations, because the people are much quicker thinkers, very fast in work. Once you spend a few days, it's not just learning, it's inspiring. You get inspired.
The next question is, in your opinion, how should we approach biostatistics? It is a feared sort of, a region.
First is, without statistics, there is no study. Not just, statistics is not about making a paper. Statistics is about making a judgment of a paper. For example, if your statistics is strong, you will decide whether what the paper has said, how true it is or how junk, or you just have to discard it. Every clinician who claims himself or herself to work on this kind of a work, research or anything in the clinic has to understand biostatistics. Like I said earlier, it used to be, there was one course in CMC Vellore. There was one course conducted in St. John's. It was a very complex scenario. Now, I think with people like you, everything is changed. So what I feel is biostatistics is not to publish your paper. Biostatistics makes you to understand the research in a very logical way. If you don't know biostatistics, you'll read a paper like a newspaper, and everything which is written on that becomes truth. Statistics helps you to become a better clinical researcher, not just to publish. This is my take home on statistics.
Right. And also I think, the take papers from bench to bedside, where we try and apply these clinical trials to our patients. Statistics really gives us, gives that paper credibility, right? Credibility in terms of, should I take this treatment modality to my patient?
And you will probably teach the world, because you will have to tell, okay, this paper is your site, everybody is citing a paper, but this paper has more of flaws.
Then a very important question is, how do you get so many research ideas? They're just flowing through your mind all the time. So how does that happen?
I mean, to be very clear, Dr. Sen Gupta, there is nothing called an idea. I would always, when people say, "How do you get ideas?" Every day there's not a day where we go home without writing or getting started to write a paper. What get accepted not is not in my hand. The reason is there is not a day in all our clinics where we can't write a concept. We can't. There is always a day if you keep your mind open. So I'm saying that you don't need ideas. You just have to be very, very curious about everything in your outpatient department or your OT or surgery. So when it happens, the idea is nothing but curiosity, which is not answered. If you sit and think that, okay, I want to go to my OPD and I will come out with an idea, and trust me, that day you will never get an idea and you'll have to wait for months together because you don't know what to do. So saying that you will work only when you get an idea is a doomsday for a researcher. You have to go into your thing, into your work, thinking that what is bothering me which needs an answer? What is the curiosity which needs an answer? And trust me, every single thing we have done, whether it's a case report or a paper in one of the best journals in the world today, everything have come out from curiosity. Because if you don't have that curiosity-driven gene in you, then you are wasting time saying that you're doing a research. See if you can have that curiosity in you. That's my strong statement here.
So I think always being curious also, keeps you at an adrenaline rush, right? All the time. You're all the time thinking about what more and what more.
Absolutely.
So this is a question I'm going to pose only to you and to nobody else. Is how did you come up with the idea of pursuing a PhD, and why did you feel the need for it, and how do you think it helps you in your daily activities, and do you recommend a PhD if possible? Because we see a lot of international faculty or MD PhDs. So I'm sure it definitely does help, and so we would like to know from you how and why, what. So whatever you can contribute.
There are two things which happened. One is, like I said, like you just mentioned, whenever you go for all these good meetings and you see a good speaker, I always have this curiosity to see what they have done, and hardly see some good researcher without a PhD. And I always felt, okay, then I said, okay, this is a degree. Then after that person starts speaking, then you realize there's a huge difference in how a hardcore researcher speaks with his own work and his PhD than somebody who's however good you are. There's a way in which they are groomed. I mean, I'm talking about the Western world. When I started mingling with people, with my work, with my research, if you are not a PhD in that subject or that area, your respect in that community is not that good. You may have 500 publications, but there is always that a bit of thing, you may be just a clinician, that clinician, just a clinician would always be there. Oh, you are a clinician. Okay, great. You're doing good work. But that time I realized that, well, I should have it. Then I picked up an area which was cell biology in keratoconus, and we published close to 21 papers at that point of time. I used Europe because a lot of my research work was collaborated in Europe. So I just wanted to have a degree from Europe. The second reason I did PhD was when I wanted to start a PhD program before I became a PhD, and I tried approaching many Indian places. And that time I had a lot of difficulty getting guides. If you're not a PhD, you can't be a guide. And they were very difficult to get because we don't have a MD PhD guides in a country. So I decided that, see, if I become, and I make some of my clinicians also become, then we'll have a pool, then we can set up our own center. So at this point of time, we have 6 or 7 of consultants who are MD PhDs, and they can be the guides, and they become guides. They're still on, their whole process is on. And I've guided around 2 already. Third one, Ashwin Mohan, probably will be this year. And although those people are finished, Dr. Pooja and Dr. Natasha, they also become guides. So what happens is the whole program starts moving in a different scale. And I have my own role as a professor at the Maastricht, and I can also be a guide directly now after Ashwin Mohan. So that is how I felt it. And what makes PhD special is it makes you focus. It's nothing to do with the degree, but it's to do with the mindset. If you tell me what changed, my mindset changed.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. It's really, path breaking and, giving us a lot of opportunity to, really get focused, which is really crucial, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about that thinking room that you have?
People ask me, what do you do? It's a very simple room. There is nothing called thinking room. But I got this inspiration from, if you look at all the great saints and sages of the past, the mystics and the mysteries of them, you see that Buddha got enlightened under a tree. Somebody and God. So the tree is just a
Metaphorical.
So it is just a metaphor. That's all. But what happens is when we go there, I realize when you call it as a thinking room, even though it's just a simple room, people suddenly become fully into that thinking camp. It's like people, when you say that, okay, Buddha got enlightened under the peepal tree, people suddenly think that everybody sits there. Okay, you feel that energy. Even though it's just a tree, it could have probably sat in any other tree. It's not that it should be there. So I personally feel, like I said, that my background is psychiatry. You have to play with the mind sometimes. And I know how to play with the mind. And so I played with the mind. And every time my fellows would say, sir, I don't know why, when we go to this room, we start writing better, we start thinking better. I always smile myself and say, it's just a room.
So the next question is there any paper or a group of papers that you are most proud about or you think have been most impactful?
A lot of my work, close to around 80 or 90 papers around keratoconus. And the first paper was, that is very special to me because by definition, keratoconus is known as a non-inflammatory disease in the test book. And we had to write this paper with the definition of it's an inflammatory disease. And that was a question, and we had to prove with a lot of cell-based experiments, and it went into IOBS. It went into 2 sets of reviews from 2 different sets of authors. And finally, I'm happy that at that point of time, the editor had written that there was one particular area where we had mentioned that the role of cyclosporin drops as a drop which can stop or halt the progression of keratoconus. So he said that the paper is exceptionally brilliant. It can go immediately, but you have to change that paragraph or you can edit it. So we had 2 choices. We were desperate to get a good paper on that subject because it's going to be a landmark one for us. And the other thing is that data which we believed in was too important for us. So we wrote back with prayers again, saying that we would defend ourselves again, that this data is this, and if you consider this, then we can. So he accepted it as it is, and whatever we wanted. So that is still a very, very favorite paper of mine because it changed the way we started looking at it.
Anything in particular that you're working on now that you would want to share with the listeners? You're excited about anything?
Yeah, basically before the whole COVID happened, we were working on a point of care diagnostic kits, both which looks at your VEGF levels in your retina and ICAMs and some of those molecules. You take a little bit of VEGF and you can test it on that to see how to titrate or give your injections. That is one. We are touching a lot of work has happened on the tear film on the ocular surface and how the tear film can be a point of contact. Anand Vinekar was working on a point of kit for the ROP because you could check the VEGF in your tears also. And that was one of his Rangachari winning paper where he spoke about how the VEGF level can be monitored from the ocular surface. So a lot of work on that front. Many new we are trying to look at many new drugs for these molecules. There is a litany of drugs. In fact, we only have a very small band and we are trying to figure out. We're working on that. Huge trust is on gene therapy. We have set up the entire gene facility, which is ready, and that is one of a major thing, and that is what we've been working for the last 5 years. It took 2.5-3 years to get the gene therapy processing room. It's state of art. I mean, I would request anybody visiting Bangalore, text me. I'll take you to this. It looks like a space center when you actually go in. Then we have just started our work on a lot of animal-based testing equipments, which includes OCT for a rabbit or mouse, to study a lot of these things. So animal-based testing is something which you are going into very heavily on, because gene therapy and other things needs animal testing. We want to bring a gene therapy to cornea also, not just retina, through drops or medications. That is one area. Presently, we have submitted close to 4 or 5 big grants to the government on COVID, because the scientists we are working are not just ophthalmic scientists. They are all very strong base in immunology and virology. We are trying to find, again, developing a kit. So we have at least 4 or 5 grants, which is in the last stage of review. And I personally working a lot on the psychological aspect of this disease, because psychiatry has always been my first love. And I did spend more time. I was first 2 years I wanted to be a psychiatrist, then I dropped out and became an ophthalmologist. So there is a lot of psychiatry love still in me. So I'm working on that to bring in some changes, because you mentioned in your own article that about the number of people who are depressed. So I think we need to take care of that. So basically, from the cell to mind to body to imaging, virtually my hands are full.
Then the next question was, how did you manage to devote so much time to clinical research, being such a busy clinician and an administrator?
I don't divide my work at all. I don't know which hat I'm wearing. So when I'm a clinician, I'm a full-time researcher at that point of time. When I'm a researcher, I'm a clinician. So, if you wear hats, that today is my research day, today is my academic off, then, I can't do research that way. I do research when I'm working. So I don't have an academic off, I don't have a research day. I keep every day as my research day and every day as my clinician day. Remember one thing, you should wear invisible hats which you don't know, which is the one you're wearing. When you divide your work, then you start to make a compartment. And when you compartment your life, then you become locked in that. You become locked in. So that is something which we don't need.
So one is like the extension of the other, and then it becomes an extension of the other. And then it is seamless.
Do not make any compartments in your life if you want to do multiple things. Assume that today, don't go to the OT thinking that you are a clinician. Go to OT today that you are a researcher. You'll pick up more things than a clinician. And when you go to a research lab or wherever you want, go there as a clinician. You'll see the difference. To be very frank on this is all we have done. And I tell my students that there's no research day off. You have to, if you take a research day off, the only time you get off is when you're writing a paper, when you've done everything, not to think.
So how do you maintain a work-life balance with so much going on?
What I feel is meditation helps, and you have to spend at least 1.5 hours on your own body in whatever forms. Exercise, meditation, physical activities, and I do a lot of them as much as possible. Maintain what you eat and what you don't eat, and keep a very good track of it. And the most important thing is, again, a philosophical answer, but like a hospital a chairman is one of the most philosophical persons I have met, and he's always my mentor on this. Our tagline is "Your faith shall heal you," our hospital tagline. And he always says the greatest thing to be happy is be grateful for every day. And every day I'm grateful for everything, whatever I have. And I'm very sure, if I come to hospital, if my staff are happy, I'm grateful for that. If you have a gratefulness in everything, I think that day is a very positive day.
Any special message to young researchers who are up and coming and want to learn things from you? Any special message? I know we have gotten messages from almost every answer that you've given, but anything you want to drive home in particular?
What I want to bring in 3 important points here. The point 1 is do not just judge what you want to do based on today's situation. See, your situation today, okay, I want to be a retina surgeon. I want to be a cornea surgeon. I just want to go join a place which gives me 200 surgeries. That's a disaster for tomorrow. I think if COVID has taught us one thing, it's taught us how unpredictable our lives are. And it's going to be more unpredictable. So have something which is bigger than your present day small dream. That's the first thing, is dream big. So if you can manage to go to a place which can give you everything, please go and join. It's a once in a lifetime where you can do multiple things. There are many places, including ours, which can help you in this. If you have a dream, clear dream, whatever difficulties you have today, it's very small when you actually reach there. The second is, I have already mentioned this, do not categorize yourself into a clinician and a researcher. Just imagine that a clinician can be a great researcher and researcher can be a great clinician. And they all merge. So do not categorize. The third one is, people always use this word, or think out of box. I learned this from my chairman. Think there is no box, both in clinics and research. If you think out of box is, it's a cliche, everybody talks, but think there is no box, you will come out wonderfully well. And I wish all of you all the best. And this is not just an interview for the sake of answering questions. This is what been our passion, and we'll continue doing it. And if anyone wants to visit and get inspired, I'm always welcome. And I'm more than welcome to show you whatever we are doing. And we are more than happy to inspire you if you have time to come.
Thank you, Dr. Rohit Shetty, for all your time and taking and so passionately really bringing about all your passion into this interview. If there is one word about this interview, it's been passion. So I am already feeling elevated myself, I think. So most people who will watch this will, I think, feel elevated too. So thank you so much.
And I know Dr. Sengupta's academy needs no. I'm a big fan of his academy, and I keep seeing once in a while he dissects out a paper. Recently he did for chloroquine. And I'm not active in Facebook. There are very few people. I just open what they put. I hardly put anything. But you're lucky that there are people, and you all who want to do it, make an attempt. I have started telling my students, make an attempt and go, because it's as a clinician, training all this is not an easy job. I can put myself in his place because I'm also in that same kind of a domain. It's a tough job. And I personally worked with him when the IGO article came. I mean, all we got in 3 days was a completely 8-9 pages of fully done article. I mean, I know what difficulty it is. We are very proud of what you're doing. And I'm sure I'll make sure that all of them should use this occasions. And I want you to write those, what you're putting on the Facebook recently on chloroquine. I want you to put up more of those, because that is what inspires. In fact, I sent that link to a lot of my people saying that this is how you read a paper.
Right, sir. Yeah, so that has actually got more than 20,000 hits. That article has really got a lot of hits. Right. All right, sir. Thank you so much. And we hope to do this maybe once a year so that we can get updates from you and keep learning and keep inspiring all of us.
Absolutely. And next time, next time we do, I will do it in my lab so that we can take you around what is happening, so that we can have a peek preview in something which we as clinicians don't see. God bless you all and stay safe.